black homeless man came to a wedding uninvited, but when he grabbed the mic, everyone cried. The morning of the wedding was filled with excitement and a touch of nervous energy. Samantha woke up early. The sunlight streamed through the window of her childhood bedroom. Her heart raced with anticipation as she looked at her wedding dress, hanging gracefully on the closet door. It was finally happening, the day she had dreamed about for as long as she could remember. Her best friend and maid of honor, Emily, arrived shortly after, buzzing with excitement. They shared a few quiet moments together, reflecting on their friendship and the journey that had led to this day. Downstairs, John was getting ready with his best man, Michael, in the living room of a nearby guest house. John was usually calm and composed, but today he couldn't shake the nervous energy coursing through him. Michael noticed and cracked a few jokes to lighten the mood, easing John's tension. As they adjusted their ties and prepared for the ceremony, there was an unspoken understanding between them. This was a big day, a life-changing day. Welcome back to PlotTwister. Before we unravel today's mystery, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you're always in the loop. Back at the main house, Samantha's parents were bustling about, making sure everything was perfect. Her father, Mr. Collins, was trying to hold back tears as he checked on the final details. He had always been the rock of the family, but today, even he was feeling the emotional weight of the occasion. Her mother was no different, her face a mix of joy and sadness as she helped Samantha into her dress. The reality of her daughter getting married finally sinking in. The ceremony was set in the garden surrounded by blooming flowers and the soft hum of nature. As the guests began to arrive, there was a sense of calm anticipation in the air. The music started, signaling the beginning of the ceremony. Samantha walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Her eyes locked on John, who stood waiting with a mixture of love and awe in his eyes. As they exchanged vows, the emotions of the moment swept over everyone present. Tears were shed, smiles were shared, and when the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, a wave of applause and cheers erupted. The celebration moved to the reception area, where the joyful atmosphere continued. But even as the music played and the first dance began, a shadow lingered at the edge of the gathering, unnoticed by all but a few. A man whose presence would soon shift the course of the entire day. As the reception buzzed with laughter and celebration, Dante lingered at the edge of the crowd, his presence slowly becoming more noticeable. At first, the guests paid little attention, too absorbed in their conversations and the joy of the moment. But as he took a few steps closer, his worn clothes and tired face began to draw curious glances. The murmur of voices grew silently quieter as a few people exchanged puzzled looks. Samantha's father, Mr. Collins, was the first to really take notice. He stiffened as his protective instincts kicked in as he watched Dante from across the room. Leaning in toward the wedding planner, he whispered something, his eyes never leaving the stranger. The wedding planner, now visibly uneasy, nodded and began to make her way toward Dante, trying to maintain a polite smile despite her growing discomfort. Dante stood still, his eyes scanning the happy faces around him. There was something in his gaze, an emotion that was hard to place. It wasn't just curiosity or longing. It was deeper, almost like recognition mixed with an unspoken sadness. As the wedding planner approached him, she hesitated for a moment before gently asking if he needed help, or if perhaps he was lost. Dante looked at her, and for a second, it seemed like he might turn and leave. But before he could respond, an unexpected intervention occurred. Mrs. Patterson, John's grandmother, had been observing the scene from her seat near the front. With a warm, knowing smile, she stood up and walked over to where Dante was standing. She reached out to him, offered a plate of food as if he were just another guest. The gesture was simple but filled with kindness, and it immediately shifted the mood. The wedding planner, taken aback, stepped aside, unsure of what to do next. Dante hesitated but then accepted the plate, his hands trembling lightly. Mrs. Patterson guided him to a seat at a nearby table, inviting him to sit and eat. The guests who had been watching closely began to relax, though the air was still thick with curiosity and whispers. Who was this man? And why had Mrs. Patterson welcomed him so openly? As Dante sat down, he remained quiet, his eyes continuing to scan the room as if searching for something or someone. The whispers among the guests grew louder, speculation running wild. But Dante stayed silent, focusing on the food in front of him, though his mind was clearly elsewhere. And so the celebration continued, but with a new palpable tension in the air, as everyone wondered what role the stranger would play in the events to come. As the reception continued, Dante's presence became harder to ignore. He sat quietly at the table, slowly eating the food Mrs. Patterson had given him, but his mind seemed far away. The guests continued to glance in his direction, their curiosity growing with each passing minute. What was he doing here, and why did he seem so out of place yet so intent on staying? Inside, Dante's thoughts were a whirlwind. He felt a strange mix of emotions, nervousness, hope, and something deeper. Something that had driven him to this place without fully understanding why. The joy and laughter around him only served to heighten the contrast with his own life, a life filled with hardship and loss. Yet despite everything, he felt drawn to this moment, as if he held some significance he couldn't yet grasp. A few of the guests, emboldened by Mrs. Patterson's acceptance of him, began to approach Dante, trying to make small talk. They asked where he was from, how he ended up here, but his answers were vague, almost evasive. He wasn't rude, but he gave them little to go on, his mind clearly elsewhere. Emily, the maid of honor, who had always prided herself on her memory, watched him closely, a nagging feeling of familiarity tugging at her, though she couldn't quite place where she had seen him before. Meanwhile, John had noticed the stranger too. He watched from a distance, his brow furrowed in concern. The man's presence didn't sit right with him, but he trusted his grandmother's judgment. Mrs. Patterson had always been wise beyond her years, and if she saw something in this man worth inviting him in, John wasn't going to question it. At least not yet. As the evening wore on, the energy of the reception began to shift. The guests were still celebrating, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. The speeches were about to begin, and everyone was gathering near the stage. Dante, still seated at his table, seemed more restless now, as if something inside him was building up, pushing him toward a decision he wasn't sure he was ready to make. The best man took the microphone, started his speech with humor and heartfelt stories about the groom. The crowd laughed and applauded, but Dante barely seemed to hear it. His eyes were fixed on the couple, his mind racing. Memories long buried began to surface, fragments of a life he had tried to forget, but that refused to stay hidden any longer. The more he watched, the more he felt a pull, the need to say something, to do something. But what? And how would it be received? As the best man finished his speech, Dante knew he couldn't sit quietly any longer. He stood up slowly, catching the attention of those nearby. Whispers quickly spread through the crowd and all eyes turned to him. Dante took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest, as he prepared to do the one thing he hadn't planned on when he first walked into a wedding. A step that would change everything for him and for those around him. Dante stood there, the weight of everyone's eyes on him, as he took a shaky breath. The room fell silent, the laughter and chatter from moments ago now replaced with an air of tense anticipation. His hands trembled as he reached for the microphone, unsure of how to begin, but knowing deep down that he had to speak. Mrs. Patterson watched him with a calm encouragement, her steady gaze giving him the strength to continue. He started slowly, his voice hoarse and uncertain, thanking everyone for allowing him to be there. It was a simple start, but it caught everyone's attention. He acknowledged how out of place he must seem, a stranger among their joyful celebration. And for a moment it looked like he might stop there, overwhelmed by the emotion stirring inside him. But then he continued, his words gaining momentum as he began to tell his story. Dante spoke of a life that had once been full of promise, of a family he had loved more than anything in the world. The crowd listened, their curiosity turning to sympathy as he shared how he had lost everything, how circumstances beyond his control had led him to the streets, where every day was a struggle just to survive. The more he spoke, the more the guests found themselves drawn to his story. It wasn't just the words he used, but the raw emotion behind them. The pain of a man who had endured more than most could imagine. Tears welled up in the eyes of some, while others exchanged glances moved by the depth of his suffering. As Dante delved deeper into the past, he revealed a detail that made the air in the room grow heavy with tension. He spoke of a son he had once had, a boy he had loved dearly but had been forced to leave behind. His voice broke as he described the last time he had seen him, a memory that had haunted him for years. It was clear to everyone that this wasn't just a speech. It was a confession, a desperate plea from a man who had lost everything but hope. As he described a necklace he had given to his son before they were separated, a unique piece that held great sentimental value, something in the room shifted. Samantha gasped softly, her hand instinctively reaching for the necklace around John's neck. A necklace that matched the description perfectly. John's face paled as he stared at Dante, realization dawning in his eyes. The room was utterly silent now, the tension almost unbearable. Dante, unaware of the impact of his words, continued, his voice filled with a mix of sorrow and longing. He spoke of his regrets, of the years he had spent searching for his son, hoping for a miracle that might bring them back together. And then, with a heavy sigh, he said he had nearly given up. That he had come to this wedding today not knowing why, but feeling that something had drawn him here. John, still holding the necklace, stood frozen, his mind racing. This stranger, this man who had appeared out of nowhere, was saying things that felt impossible, yet undeniable. The crowd waited, breath held as Dante's story hung in the air, the truth on the verge of being revealed. As Dante's words hung in the air, the room seemed to hold its breath. John, still clutching the necklace around his neck, felt a rush of emotions flood through him. Confusion, disbelief, and something that felt like recognition. His heart pounded as he looked at Dante, searching his face for answers, for a connection he had long buried in the recesses of his memory. The silence stretched on, heavy and charged, until finally John moved. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on Dante, his hands trembling slightly. The guests watched in rapt attention, sensing that something monumental was about to happen. Samantha, her own heart racing, stood by, her gaze shifting between John and Dante, trying to piece together the fragments of a story that was beginning to make an impossible kind of sense. John's voice was low, almost a whisper, when he finally spoke. He asked Dante a question, one that seemed simple but carried the weight of a lifetime. Dante's response was immediate, his eyes lighting up with a mixture of hope and fear as he recognized the question, the significance of it. There was no need for further words. The truth was there, plain as day, in the expressions that passed between them. Without hesitation, John crossed the room in a few quick strides. He stood before Dante, the man who had been a stranger just moments before, and slowly, almost reverently, he removed the necklace from around his neck, holding it up for Dante to see. He watched as the older man's face crumpled, tears welling up in his eyes as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. In that moment, the crowd seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of them, father and son, standing there, united by a bond that had withstood time and hardship. Dante, overwhelmed with emotion, reached out and pulled John into a tight embrace. The room, which had been so tense just moments before, erupted into applause, tears flowing freely among the guests as they witnessed this incredible reunion. Samantha joined them, wrapping her arms around both men, her own tears of joy mixing with theirs. The guests, too, were swept away in the emotion of the moment, many of them crying as they shared in this extraordinary turn of events. Mrs. Patterson, who had watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction, smiled gently, knowing that she had played a small part in this miracle. The wedding, once simply a celebration of love between two people, had transformed into something much more profound. A celebration of family, of hope, and of the resilience of the human spirit. As the night went on, the mood of the reception shifted. There was still joy and laughter, but now it was tinged with something deeper, more meaningful. The guests mingled with Dante, offering their congratulations and welcoming him into the family with open arms. In the end, what had started as an unexpected intrusion had become the heart of the day. Dante, once lost and alone, had found his way back to his son, to a family that had unknowingly been waiting for him all these years. The night ended with a renewed sense of togetherness, as everyone gathered for one last dance. The bonds between them stronger than ever. And so, what began as a perfect wedding day became an unforgettable story of reunion and redemption. A day that none of them would ever forget. What are your thoughts on the twist we uncovered today? Comment your ideas below. Make sure to like and subscribe for a daily dose of drama and mystery. See you later with another twist.